Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Naysan Adlparvar, who is a Postdoctoral Associate and Lecturer in the program in Iranian Studies at the Council on Middle East Studies through a Rice Faculty Fellowship. Professor Adlparvar's primary research interests surround the nature of social relations in conflict-affected and transitional contexts. He currently works with the UNDP in Iraq to engage minorities and vulnerable groups in political and legislative processes. Today we'll talk with him about the changing nature of ethnic and religious identity in Afghanistan's Bamyan Valley. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Let's start with an overview of your research. Tell us about it.
So my research focuses in essence on political reconstruction in post-2001 Afghanistan and the impacts for intergroup relations. Mm-hmm. So I did my fieldwork for the research in Bamyan, which is a valley in the Central Highlands area of Afghanistan. And it's also the ancestral home for the Hazara community. Mm-hmm. Now the Hazara are an ethnic Shia minority, but there are two other major communities there. One is the Tajik community, which is an ethnic Sunni community, and also the Sadat community. And they are descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and that gives them a particular religious charisma, mm-hmm. which they use to interrelate with the government, between the Hazara community and the government, and also more generally in terms of religious leadership in that community.
Okay. So they are seen to have more prestige because of the
Absolutely.
Muhammad connection?
Traditionally and typically that's the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why Afghanistan? What led you to be interested in this region of the world?
Well, my heritage is one of the reasons that kind of brings me to that. My father's Iranian, my mother's English. I grew up in the UK. But essentially one of my interests was to work overseas in that part of the world, generally speaking, mm-hmm. which took me to Afghanistan. And I went there initially to work with the UN in about 2006, and I spent 2 or 3 years working with the UN and small local organizations on various development interventions. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I found is that as security deteriorated, my engagement and the engagement of the international community as a whole was very limited with our Afghan counterparts. Mm-hmm. So it became frustrating, policies based on assumptions about what's happening, and I wanted to kind of overcome that, and doing research on the ground for an extended period is one way of doing that. Mm-hmm. And then really as I started to look at that kind of research process, the sociological and anthropological literature on Afghanistan, it became clear that ethnicity was one entry point. And given my own background, my mixed heritage, it was something that initially I connected with and I really wanted to explore. So it was both a professional and personal journey. Mm-hmm.
When you're doing the research, I would imagine there's not a lot of written work to draw from. Mm. Is that correct? And then I'd like to have you talk a little bit about how your academic work has contributed to the field.
Sure, you're absolutely right. The literature, particularly on identity in Afghanistan, is very fractured, it's very outdated, because limited research has been done since 1979 when the conflict started in the country mm-hmm. with the Soviet occupation. So there are some pieces of work which do talk about the Hazara community, for example, but there's very little there really mm-hmm. To build upon. So what I wanted to do was to contribute academically and empirically to that gap, as it were. And I think there was 3 things that I really wanted to talk to. Okay. The first was the literature on national integration and power sharing. And what I really wanted to do is take the shifts that took place in Afghanistan after the Constitution was ratified in 2004 and look at those implications as it comes down to local levels, to individuals, to those communities that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. That was one area. The second is really to talk specifically to the Afghanistan-specific academic literature. Conceptually, it's very fragmented, it's quite dated. So trying to draw together that literature, the concepts, present a new idea or state-of-the-art kind of thinking on mm-hmm. ethnicity and identity. And then empirically, the third area is to document what's going on. And as I said earlier, there are some pieces of literature which look at the Hazara community, but I wanted to look at contemporary changes, areas for violence, areas for tension, how that's happening, on what basis mm-hmm. it's happening, to really kind of open that discussion up.
And what years are you looking at again?
Well, the fieldwork was done 2010 to 12 as part of my PhD, mm-hmm. but I'm going back even to the end of the 19th century, starting there looking at the formation of ethnicity and identity, but more post-2004, but particularly at that period that I did my fieldwork.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned I know there's chronic insecurity in Afghanistan. So when you're doing your fieldwork during that 2-year time period, tell us about that. Were you ever concerned? And I know you also were working with a variety of other students too to assist you in doing your work. So tell us about that fieldwork process.
It's obviously not an easy place to do work. That was one of the reasons that I selected Bamyan, was not only because of the ethnic diversity, but because it's one of the safest provinces in Afghanistan.
Okay.
But just getting access to do that, it was a 5-month ethical clearance process with the university, which was unprecedented for my colleagues at the time. And there's 2 main concerns there. One was primarily about the safety of my research participants, those I was interviewing, and also my safety. So we took some of the typical academic steps in terms of informed consent, making sure that people knew the danger they were placing themselves in, which clearly they did, and also anonymizing information, making sure it was securely stored. But in terms of actually doing the research, the main way that my security was ensured was I was hosted by an international organization that has an office there. I stayed in their guest house, which thankfully is in the center of one of the communities that I was working with, but did pose some challenges in terms of isolating me from that community. And I was subject to security information coming from the organization. So on 3 occasions I can think of, I was unable to go to the community or the village that I wanted to go to because of some kind of smoldering conflict or some tensions that had been perceived or kind of through kind of intelligence or gathering information. So we had to kind of reorganize the schedule. But generally speaking, it unfolded without any major problems, which is always good.
Right, that's great. So when you were doing your fieldwork, were there any surprises that you just did not anticipate?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones, you mentioned about the students I was working with, and they were from a local university, University of Bamyan. One of the first interviews that I remember doing was going to interview a member of the Sadat community, and he was quite an important figure, and I went with my 2 Hazara colleagues, one that was translating for me or supporting in translation, and one that was note-taking. And it was a really awkward and comfortable kind of encounter, which I kind of cut short. And afterwards, I was kind of talking to my colleagues about what exactly went wrong. And it became obvious very quickly that because we're talking about Hazara-Sadat relationships, it's political, it's sensitive, it was uncomfortable because of the team I was working with. So what I ended up having to do was to work with 3 teams, 2 men and 2 women from each of those ethnic communities. So I had a team of 12 in the end, simultaneously doing research. So once we got around that obstacle, it was then a case of actually managing the volume of work that was going on and making sure it was transcribed correctly, which was intensive, but produced a lot of really good data at the end.
Okay. Tell me about some specific examples of tensions that you tracked while you were there.
Well, I looked at 2 main case studies between the Hazara-Tajik dimension and the Hazara-Sadat dimension. And in the latter case, as we mentioned earlier, the Sadat community have this, let's say, religious superiority, or at least perceived that way because of historically the role they've played in the Hazara community. And they've always taken wives from the Hazara community, often as second wives, but never given their daughters to be married to the Hazara community. So it really exemplifies that power relationship. But what's happening now is the Hazara community, with an increasing status that's come from the way the state has reorganized and allocate resources in Bamyan, they've started to say, well, why can't we marry? There's nothing religiously that stops us. It's just a tradition. So there's increasing cases of elopement taking place now in Bamyan, in which Hazara men run away with Sayyid women. But the Sadat community retaliates very violently to try and maintain that relationship. And although there are political reasons, this is one of the interfaces at which the 2 communities are really kind of coming apart and differentiating themselves. And I've tried to document that process. On the flip side, looking at the Tajik community, I've looked very much at mourning rituals, and one in particular, which is Ashura, which really looks at the oppression that the Shia community, in this case the Hazara community, has faced historically at the hands of Sunni communities or the Sunni state in the way it's articulated here. So we find very much that somewhat through Iranian influence in terms of the way these rituals are played out, you're seeing an increasing tension being driven between these two sectarian groups. And this has happened after 2004, once the constitution recognized the ability for the Shia community to practice their rituals. So again, I've tried to demonstrate and look at that cleavage as it kind of opens up between those communities.
Okay, and what do you conclude ultimately?
Well, I think there's three main things I conclude. The first is really looking at the very ethnic nature in which the state is now operating since 2001. And again, that goes back to the constitution, the way the government has been structured, the way resources are allocated. And that really shows that this has become a modus operandi of the way the government functions, the way that people make claims or communities make claims against the state for greater security, more resources or services, and the way that the president in particular appeals to those communities to try and win votes. And in saying that, because there's this kind of ethnic nature of politics, ethnic identities become increasingly salient or prominent in everyday life, for better or for worse. And personally, I don't think increasing social differentiation is a good thing. So I don't think in the long run that's going to have a great impact on Afghan society. Secondly, I think it's also important to recognize that this process of political reconstruction or development more generally is actually, or potentially, a violent process. As I mentioned earlier, these changing relationships between groups, when you're challenging old inequalities, can result in violence.
Right.
And I think we need to understand that better. I think we need to work to mitigate that better, both in terms of the state and the international community. And the last area, which is more a general set of findings that my research outlines, is really just understanding the way that ethnicity or ethnic identity functions in the case of Bamyan. And to show how that functions and to understand better the need for political analysis and for the workings in everyday settings, which is something that really hasn't been done adequately in the context of Afghanistan.
And on that note, will you be pursuing further research there on those issues?
Yeah, actually we're hosting a conference at Yale in April, which will start to open up those issues about identity, not just ethnic identity, but other forms of identity, which could range from the impact of returnees coming back and having effects on older and younger generations and the way that that is deployed or functions in Afghan society. There's a whole host of areas we hope to open up and to publish on in the coming year or so.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here today and
Thank
sharing
you for
some
having
of your
me.
work.
Thanks.
For more information about Professor Adlparvar and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.